Thank you, Brian. I've never been introduced by somebody from a hospital bed before. That's pretty awesome. In our ways out here out west, we'd say you cowboy it up. That's good. I want to thank the Rotary Club there for giving me the time this morning to talk about some of my experiences here as a chief and the things the Louie-Osoyoos Indian Band does here, and the Rotary Club in Osoyoos. We decided as a band, as a First Nation, a few years ago to actually belong to Rotary. And the Louie-Osoyoos Indian Band is only a few minutes from the US-Canada border. When back in the Oregon Treaty was done in the 1840s, and the British and the Americans decided to make the 49th parallel, this dividing line called the US-Canada border now. They cut my people and my territory in half. So like all the First Nations along that US-Canada border that's only been there a few hundred years in the thousands and thousands of year history of the First Nations, whether it's the Blackfoot people in southern Alberta or the Mohawk people in southern Ontario, all the First Nations, all the tribes along that border, it's actually been a huge problem with us. And then when the reserve systems or the reservation systems came in my territory, they created 7 reserves on this side of the border in the Okanagan Nation territory and 1 big reservation in Washington State. That reservation that my people are on just across the border, and half of Osoyoos Lake, a portion of Osoyoos Lake, is actually in Washington State. So we cross that border all the time, even with COVID. Status Indians can still cross the border because that's our tribal territory, our ancestors, our immediate families just right across the border. And the reservation system and the reserve system, it's weird how closely those names are. Americans call them Indian reservations. Canada called them Indian reserves. And in Washington, DC, they created this monster called BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The natives, the Indians down there say BIA means Boss Indians Around. And in Canada, John A. Macdonald and others created DIA, the Department of Indian Affairs, which I call the Department Against Indians Achieving. Now, of course, they've changed their name, that name in Canada. Now it's called Indigenous Services Canada. And in Canada, they started residential schools. But all they did was watch what George Washington and others were doing with what they called it. If you read the old documents, the history of Canada and the States, they use this term Indian problem. You'll see the word Indian problem throughout the history of Canada and the US. We got an Indian problem out west. So that word Indian, and I know in today's, and I actually, I think the whole society has gotten too sensitive. Big problem with these things. Notice my Redskin, I got my Redskin phone here. I got my Redskin helmet in back of me. Our people have become too sensitive and they listen to the internet BS that gets spread, the fake news. And COVID even has a lot of fake news on these things. But I believe our people, not just Native people, people in general have become too sensitive. And this is how they talk now. They talk with their fingers. Too many people talk with their fingers. Yesterday in the office here, I told some of my managers and staff, quit talking with your fingers. Talk with your voice to people. Why are we texting each other all the time or emailing each other when we should be talking voice to voice? I know, like many of you, I'm old school. I always tell people, if something's not important, send me an email. But if something's important, phone me, because we're going to talk voice to voice. We're not going to talk with our fingers. So getting back to the US-Canada border, decades ago, geez, I've been traveling that border, going past that border all my life. And then I recognized this plaque. There's a plaque at that border. It's pretty high. It's a bronze plaque. And it's the Rotary plaque, the four-way test that I'm sure all of you know. And I took a picture of it many years ago, and I've used it in my speaking presentations all over Canada and the US. The four-way test in anything we think, do, or say. I love those four rules, Rotary's four rules, especially the first one. What's the truth? Get to the truth. On any issue, get to the truth. So when I decided, now that I'm in my 60s, I'm an avid reader, and I love it when Jim, president there, I see all your books in the background there. When I go into somebody's house or office, Jimmy Patterson's office, Jean Chrétien's office, Premier's offices, first thing I do is I go to their bookcase, because I want to know what that successful person reads. Because I learned from a wise person many years ago, and I love quotes. So I'm going to be using a lot of quotes, and they're not my quotes. They're quotes from whether it's elders or whether it's my mom or whether it's successful people, books I've read. I've got a huge book collection. I got a whole stack of unread books. Whenever I'm in an airport, or I'm always buying more books. But one author once said, most people are influenced by two major ways in their life: by the people they meet and the books they read. And I believe that a lot of my leadership lessons come from books. And when I was inducted into Canadian Business Hall of Fame a few years ago, I was the first Redskin, First Nation ever inducted into Canadian Business Hall of Fame. In Peter Mansbridge, I'm sure you all know who Peter Mansbridge is. He told me he was one of the ones that pushed for me to be inducted. And then this person in BC, most people know Jimmy Patterson's name, but they don't know Peter Brown's name. Peter Brown is another Jimmy Patterson in the province of BC. Very wealthy man. He phones me up out of the blue and he says, I'm going to push for you to get inducted in the Canadian Business Hall of Fame, because I sit on their board and all I see are these white guys. We all look the same. He goes, that's not what Canada is. We need to go start recognizing other people besides just white guys, successful white men. Any case, when I first met him in his fancy restaurant in Vancouver, he's probably in his 70s. Of course, he should be retired, but like Jimmy Patterson, even in his 90s, Jimmy still gets to the office most of the times by 6 a.m. I wish I could do that. I'm still getting my beauty rest at that time. I wish I could get up at 6 a.m., be in my office at 6 a.m. Any case, when I met Peter Brown for the first time, he's sitting in this fancy restaurant all by himself in the corner. I go up to him, say hi to him. First thing I notice, he's holding this thick book. And I said, Peter, what's that book you're reading? It was a book on leadership. And first thing I did was I pulled out my phone. I said, can I take a picture of that book? Because I love reading books on leadership. Most people that get elected, whether it's to mayors, councils, provincial, federal, even Indian reserves, most people don't have a book collection. They don't study leadership. They don't read things on leadership. Most people think when they get voted in or get appointed to a manager's job, they're an instant leader. There is no such thing as an instant leader. I thought it was really neat, and it says a lot about Peter Brown, that at his age, he's already successful, multi-millionaire. He's sitting there reading a book on leadership. I thought, wow. I don't have that book, and I haven't read that book. I haven't seen that book on leadership, so I took a picture of it. After my meeting with him, I went to the bookstore and bought that book. I thought, if he's still reading a book on leadership at his age and as successful as he is, there's a lesson right there for all of us. There is no finish line in leadership. There is no finish line in business. There's no finish line in this relationship, this broken relationship with First Nations in Canada. And when I decided to finally write my own book, and thank you, Brian, for promoting it. And I think I signed some for your group out there and sent them back out. So the book called Res Rules. I got my Habs jersey on. See that? I hope we got some Habs fans in the group there. I know you're probably mostly Toronto, but that's okay. Symbolism is very important. I love of course, I love the History Channel. And I love looking at the symbolism of various cultures or societies, or like the Greeks or the Romans, even the Nazis. You look at the symbolism and how powerful and how that moves people. And great societies have symbols. The Americans have a lot of symbolism in their America. The symbolism on the back of the book. The Beaver Pelt. I just finished a book that Peter Brown asked me to read. He phones me up at Sunday morning about a month ago or so. He says, Clarence, you got to read this book about the history of how Canada was formed. It's called The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson Bay Empire. I just finished listening to it as an audiobook. It's amazing, all of these explorers that came through Canada came from back east, out west. Mackenzie, Fraser, you go on and on. But they all say the Hudson Bay Company, the first relationship that the French, the English, the Scottish, the Dutch had with First Nations people in this country was an economic relationship based on the fur trade. And that's what I tell Native people. We got to get back to that original treaty relationship based on commerce, based on, then they called it trade. But trade is just another word for business and commerce, isn't it? That's the way I look at it. Our first relationship as Native people, as First Nations people. I don't care if you're Micmac on the coast, if you're Iroquois in Ontario, and again, recognizing for the Fort Williams First Nation, the Nish in the Ojibwe in your region was based on the fur trade. And it's so neat to read those old journals, the Hudson Bay Company journals. When Hudson Bay Company came into my territory here in the Okanagan, they built a couple of forts, Fort Kamloops, Fort Okanagan, Fort Colville, and they brought Iroquois people over. They mention a lot. They use the word Iroquois/Mohawk. My great-great-grandfather had a picture of his dad. He always said his dad was Iroquois. So again, that's the symbolism on my book, is that beaver pelt, the fur trade. But the other history that's proven in the Hudson Bay journals, how they got out west was the old Indian trails. And these explorers said that these tribes, these bands already had a system of trade with each other. So I remind First Nations people, we were the first entrepreneurs on this land. We were the first business people. We already had a system of trade, which is commerce again. It's business and commerce. Archaeological evidence proves that over and over again. In Louie-Osoyoos, on the lake, about 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I'm getting old, so I forget these years as they go by. Once you get over 50, time just flies. But in a provincial campground, they had a backhoe there, they were digging, and they had to stop because they found human remains. We stopped that dig. But in any case, some of the items found in that grave that proved to be over 1,500 years old, over 1,500. Some of the white people in the region here were getting mad at us because we stopped the digging and we shut down the provincial park. And it was in the newspapers here. How does the Sioux Indian band how do they know those are native bones? They could be non-native. It could be a non-native burial. And I went to the paper and said, well, these ancestral remains have been proven to be over 1,500 years old. So do you think the Vikings were on Louie-Osoyoos Lake? I don't think the Vikings were on Louie-Osoyoos Lake. I don't even know where the Vikings come from, but they come from somewhere in Europe. In any case, what they found, some of the items they found in that ancestral grave weren't from BC, wasn't from Washington State. It was farther south, southern states. And that's been done over and over. These archaeological evidence has proven that the tribes, the First Nations, had a system of trade between each other that extended thousands of miles, north, south, east, west. We did trade with the coastal people here in Louie-Osoyoos, in the middle of BC. We did trade with the Plains people, the Blackfoot people in Alberta. So I remind First Nations people, we have to get back on our economic, what one of the national chiefs said, our economic horse. Because no matter what race of people you are, it's the economy that is the engine and the heartbeat of any country or city or town. And I want to get back to that original treaty relationship, which was based based on business and commerce, not handouts. I don't want handouts. In those Hudson Bay journals, all of you should read that book, The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudson Bay Empire. And see how hard the explorers talk about how hard it was to get to no cell phones, no electricity. In the travel they did, in the commerce they did, and the trade that they did, and how some tribes played middlemen because they knew the basis of economics and how hard it was to make a living back then. There was no light switches to flick. You didn't go down to the grocery store and get your food. You didn't go to the stores to buy your clothes. Everyone back then worked hard. First Nations come from a working, I remind First Nations, we come from a working culture. No native group sat on their ass. We didn't wait for funding. We went out and sheltered ourselves, clothed ourselves, fed ourselves. So here at Osoyoos, we got going with the town of Osoyoos and the town of Oliver. We got that symbolism of a working relationship, a business relationship with the local towns here. A business relationship. And of course, the Crown. Our relationship as First Nations people is with the federal government. We have big issues in every province, and here, especially in the province of BC, with the BC government. Our original relationship in this Canadian Constitution is with the Crown, is with the federal government, not the provincial governments. But now we have to deal with the provincial governments. The $5 bill, that symbolism is how ridiculous the Canadian government still treats our people. They use this term now called truth and reconciliation. And I see all over Canada land acknowledgements. Those are nice gestures, but they don't build one house on my res. They don't supply any program dollars for our education program, our social service program, our health programs, elders programs. They're nice gestures. Peter Mansbridge asked me, Clarence, how does that feel when business people stand up and all of these conferences or meetings, whether it's mayors and councils or whatever, and they do the land acknowledgement? Well, we'd like to acknowledge we're on the lands, we're holding our meeting on the lands of the Okanagan people. And I told them, well, it's kind of like you're in our house. We got kicked out to the yard. And every once in a while, you invite us into our house. And you acknowledge that we're holding this meeting in your house. So to me, it's a nice gesture, but it really doesn't provide much in terms of all the broken treaties, all the land ripoffs, all the reserve lands that were taken away. And if you read the old documents, they all say the same thing. And even in the States, even after the reserves and reservations were set up, most reserves got reduced as more settlers came in the region. And in our case, they took away our OK Falls Reserve, our Indian Reserve number 2. They took it away from us in 1915 with a swipe of a pen. The settlers were putting pressure on the federal and provincial government, basically saying in these old documents, those Indians are not doing anything with the land. We need it. So they took it away from us, some of our existing reserves. There's a reserve in BC that just got $100 million land claim settlement over old reserve land that was taken away in the late 1800s. So again, people have to realize that we don't make up land claims. We don't just make this stuff out of our head. Now that we can hire lawyers and look into the old documents, look into the old ripoffs, we can actually take the federal or provincial government to court. And we've won many court cases. But the other issue with this $5 bill, the numbered treaties, and I think Thunder Bay might live in a numbered treaty area, I'm not sure. But in these numbered treaties, especially on the prairies, it was written that the Indians get $5 in 1877, just as a year. Can you believe it still today in 2022? What's going to happen? And COVID might have some, of course, COVID has some restrictions. But the federal government's going to send staff out to these treaty areas in Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. They're going to send a high-paid bureaucrat out there. He's going to be carrying a suitcase full of crisp $5 bills. He's going to show up on these Indian reserves. You're going to put out a table. Your government's going to go to these Indians with high-paid bureaucrats with a suitcase full of money. Sounds like the mafia. Suitcase full of money. And who's going to be standing on the left and right of them? Is 2 RCMP officers in their red serge. You know when they wear the red with the cowboy hat or whatever you want to call it, and the cowboy boots? They're going to stand off to the side. It's called Treaty Days. They're going to open up the suitcase of $5 bills and hand out $5 bills in 2022 as these Indians line up to get their $5 bill. I wrote in my book, that should be embarrassing, and it's ridiculous. It should be embarrassing to every Canadian that still happens. Reconciliation in bookkeeping terms is an easy thing to figure out. I'm sure most of you could take your calculator and figure out, isn't it common sense that a $5 bill given out in 1877 is not the same as a $5 bill given out in 2022? Isn't that easy to figure out? I had my bookkeeper here do it. You go through inflation or the CPI index or whatever that simple calculation is, reconciliation. They should not be handing out $5 bills to the numbered treaty communities. It's an easy reconciliation. If you really believe in truth and reconciliation, reconcile that. Quit handing out $5 bills to Indians on treaty days. I understand the symbolism of it. I get that part of it. I actually phoned up some of my Cree friends in northern Alberta. I said, do you really line up for a $5 bill? One of the council members from one of the reserves said, hell no. I skip a few years. I wait till mine adds up to at least $20, then I'll stand in line for a $20 bill. So that's just one small example of how Canada has to reconcile its relationship with First Nations people. And a wise white man, when I talk to people, I use white and Indian. I don't know if you guys are overly sensitive about that. I'm sorry about that. That's the way I talk. People, the white people that work for us here, we got lots of white people that work for us here. In fact, when you have a good relationship with somebody, you don't need to be politically correct. You don't need to be overly sensitive about how you talk to each other. Isn't that right? I mean, the white buddies I used to play hockey with, because we were buddies, they would say, "Oh, you Indians," and we would say back, "Oh, you white guys," because we were buddies. That's the way you talk to each other. I have an Italian buddy and a Japanese buddy. You should see the things they say to each other. But that's what relationship building has to get down to where we can say shit that some people would say, "Oh, that's not politically correct." We use the term Indian here. And of course, it depends who you talk to, because especially nowadays, some of the First Nations that are what my mom calls high society, urban educated Indians, they want to be spoken at differently. Some of them don't like the term Indian. But here on my res, we're cowboys and Indians still. We call the white people cowboys, they call us Indians, and we love it. We're buddies. We got this built, we got this relationship down to, we can say shit to each other that might be over the line with, of course, with strangers. We all do that with each other, right? I mean, Brian, if you and I start hanging out, I'll be calling you a white guy, and you can call me, "Hey, you stupid Indian." I'll say, "You crazy white man." There's nothing wrong with that. Jesus. So when you read my book, you're going to see stuff in there like that. And we have over 1,000 jobs on this res. Actually, we hire more non-natives than we do native people. And I tease the white guys that I went to high school with back in the 70s. When I see them on the street, I said, "You're still working on the res. You're collecting a paycheck on the res. That's what's paying your mortgage." And I said, "Thank you for working on the res." And they thank me for providing them a job on the res. That's what we got to get back to, where natives and non-natives can have this conversation without being politically correct, without treating each other like strangers, and get back to where we work together. Our ancestors worked together. We traded with each other. We had commerce. We worked together. And then the government turned it into this dependency relationship with First Nations, where they kept on taking and taking and taking. So it's great to see, even in Ontario, many First Nations have a good business relationship with their local town, city. I can't remember the last time that when I spoke in Thunder Bay. I've spoken there before. I can't remember who had me out there speaking. I'm pretty sure I went to the Fort Williams First Nation. And as I mentioned, that Rotary plaque is a guiding principle for me, and I use it all the time. The 4-way test, I use it all the time. In the Rotary Club that we have in Louie-Osoyoos, they've been in our office, our band office here many, many times. Great group of people. Rotary, of course, is a great organization. And that's the type of, once you establish business relationships, everything else can get taken care of. Everything else can. And that's what I'm reminding First Nations, to develop a business relationship, get involved with clubs like like Rotary. We got to get to know each other again. And that's how Canada's going to become a better place. There should be no First Nations that live in third world conditions in one of the richest countries in the world. But the sad fact is, I've been on hundreds of Indian reserves, north, south, east, west, reservations in the southern states. And still half, maybe a little more, still have over 50% unemployment. And if you do just a little bit of research, you'll see that during the Great Depression, at its peak, 30% unemployment. So that says to me that half of these First Nations in this country are still under a Great Depression. And it shouldn't be that way. And the other thing is our loss of language and culture. And of course, the residential school issue is coming to bear. Kamloops Indian Band is only 3 hours north of here. People one generation above me, my dad, was sent to Kamloops Indian Residential School. Our people here on Louie-Osoyoos, they were either sent to Kamloops Indian Residential School or to Cranbrook in the Kootenays, which is about 7 hours away. You can imagine little kids, and nothing pisses me off more than talking about residential school or boarding schools in Washington. You know, my people that were sent to boarding school in Washington State. In my book, I have a chapter on residential schools and some of the stories from my own people. In the 215 unmarked graves that were found there in Kamloops, that's been replayed over and over again across this country. Williams Lake Indian Band in the middle of BC is having a news conference today at 1 o'clock our time. They're going to publicly announce what was found at that residential school. So Canada has to own up to its past, not just with land acknowledgements, but with what happened at residential schools that were paid for by the Canadian government and ran by the churches for 100 years. You can't sweep that under the rug. You can't just say that's in the past. Here on Louie-Osoyoos Indian Reserve, people younger than me were sent to that Kamloops Indian Residential School back in the 70s, 60s. So that's not ancient history. People younger than me were sent there. So I hope Canada can own up to its mistakes. Not just with words. There was an elder that said this at a meeting I was at. And he said, we cannot say goodbye to our problems till we first say hello to them. Here's a good quote. We cannot say goodbye to our problems till we say hello to them. And this residential school issue is going to go on for quite a long time. One of the most emotional trips I've ever been on was when we went up to that Kamloops Indian Residential School last summer with all the residential school survivors from this community, all the elders, all the kids. We made a trek up there. In this summer, we're going to make a trek to the Cranbrook Indian Residential School, because many of my people still alive today were sent there as little kids. When I ask non-Native people, what would you do if somebody came and tried to take your kids away? People I've asked here said they would kill them. If anybody ever tried to take my kids away, I don't care if they're RCMP, you're gonna have to bring an army to try and take my kids away. So truth and reconciliation is what we have to concentrate on now as a country. And I think most Canadians are up to that task. One of the best images that I'll remember going up to Kamloops, we had a planned trip on a particular day and time to leave our reserve here. Whole line of cars. And of course, I rode my motorcycle. And social media can also be used for a good thing. We never told anybody, we never put it in the newspaper. We told our people here on Louie-Osoyoos, meet us 9 o'clock in the morning. We're all gonna line up here, get in our cars and our motorcycles. We're all gonna make our trip up to Kamloops. Somebody got on social media, whether it's Facebook or whatever it may be. It was during the day. It was middle of the week. As soon as we left the reserve, we seen hundreds of white people lined up wearing orange shirts. Adults, kids wearing orange shirts. Lined up off the reserve, waving at us, holding up signs, because they knew what we were doing. And they wanted to show their feelings to us. That was something. These white people in town here didn't have to do that, but they did it. Out of this,